knows who said baseball has been very, very good to me?
Barry Bonds.
Lou Gehrig.
No.
Lou Gehrig.
Lou Gehrig.
Babe
Nope.
Ruth.
Nope.
Willie
If
Mays.
you check them,
Babe Ruth.
Willie Mays.
nope,
Buster
Nope.
Posey.
Joe DiMaggio.
no, no. Okay, there's a big fight. There's a big fight on the internet. It's either it's attributed to two baseball players. One is Roberto Clemente, who is from Puerto Rico, and the other, whom I think is the original, is Minnie Mendoza, who played for the Chicago White Sox back in the 60s, 50s, and 60s, and he was from Cuba. All right. All right, so I'm going to welcome, we are recording. This is our agenda. We've got a really full plate, so I probably spent too much time on the trivia, but I really want to introduce right now our scholar speaker of the month, Sophie Ruehr. She's a first-year PhD candidate at UC Berkeley. This one is a super rising star. She uses satellite imaging to inform sustainable water management, and I have no idea how she does that, but that's what she told me. She graduated from Yale in geology and geophysics with a GPA of 3.89. She's not, perfect, but like really summa cum laude. She participated in an international honors program on the politics of climate change, which took her to Morocco, Bolivia, and Vietnam. And she is already the author on 4 scientific publications and the winner of not 4, I think it's 8 science awards.
Wow.
So Sophie, I could sing a lot of praises, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen and have you share yours.
All right, Joe, thank you so much for the introduction. It's so great to see all of your faces here and all of your caps today. I should be also wearing mine, maybe in solidarity, but I'm really glad to be speaking with you all. I'm going to go ahead and, hi, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Here we go. I think you all should be able to see this now. Does it look good? Okay, great. Yeah, so as Joe said, I'm a first-year PhD student. So today I'm going to be talking with you all a little bit about my field and some data methods I want to use. I don't have too much research results to present today, but I'm hoping this could be a good starting off point, and really looking forward to hearing your thoughts on all of this. So today I'm going to be talking about using satellites to study carbon, water, and climate change. Okay, so just to kind of give you an overview of where I'm hoping to go today, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change first, and the carbon and water cycles, to kind of give you an overview of my field and the big questions that we're thinking about. Then I'll talk a little bit more about what I'm focusing on, which are using satellites to study these questions. And then finally, I'll wrap it up with some directions I want to go and some research questions I hope to pursue throughout the course of my PhD. And just to help you keep track of where we are, I have that little green bar on the right-hand side showing the different topics that we'll cover. And also feel free to interrupt me at any time if you have questions. Okay, climate change is scary. I'm sure all of you know about it, and it's very frightening to consider that fires and droughts and extreme weather events like hurricanes are getting worse over time. A lot of science shows that these types of events are going to increase in intensity and frequency in the coming decades and already have. Also, just the justice and equity implications of these things are really profound and kind of ask really deep questions to our society about who matters and who is suffering the worst consequences of these extreme weather events. I think someone is unmuted and it's a little noisy. Can everyone check to make sure that you're muted? Thank you. Great. So climate change is scary. And something that's really scary is that we're not doing enough to stop it. So there are some great policy ideas out there, like the Green New Deal, I think is a great idea, really transformative. And President Biden has also made some really big steps compared to previous administrations in terms of climate change. One of these big steps is trying to become climate neutral. So this is a little figure showing when a bunch of different countries are planning to be climate neutral. Biden has recently announced he's planning for the US to be climate neutral by 2050, along with the EU, Germany, the UK, some other countries. So this is something, it's not bad, but it's still, you know, several decades out. And also I have a lot of skepticism about one part of this, which is this net zero idea. How can you be net zero? This is one thing I've been thinking a lot about. And there's actually some companies that have already started to do net zero type policies. So I'm going to ask us to think about one in particular right now, which is JetBlue. This airline company has pronounced themselves CO2 neutral. When you fly JetBlue, when you take off, they say, "Welcome to JetBlue. This flight is net neutral and there's no carbon emitted." And it's a nice optimistic picture. You know, it's nice that they're trying. But I have some edits to make here. So first of all, this pristine airplane flying over this green world is actually polluting a ton of greenhouse gases into the air. So really, the plane should look like this. And they say that for every flight, they're planting a certain number of trees that will offset the amount of carbon that this flight releases. So, okay, here they go, they plant some trees. That's great, it's a nice idea. But in reality, scientists don't really know. Joe, was that you? Okay, I think we're okay. Scientists don't really know in reality whether this actually works. So there's these equations that say, you know, X number of trees for X number of flights, but they make a lot of assumptions and they don't take into account how climate change might affect trees growing over time. So for example, maybe there's a big drought and a tree dies. Maybe there's a big fire and a tree burns up. Or maybe it's just too hot or the tree doesn't get enough water and it doesn't grow as tall as the scientists project. So JetBlue is making a lot of assumptions here about how planting trees will offset their carbon emissions, especially into the future when there's a lot more unknowns as these other climate extremes are increasing and droughts are becoming more frequent and fires are becoming bigger. And it's also kind of scary to think about this because so many countries and policymakers are really relying on these types of carbon neutralities in all of their climate change planning. So my last edit to this picture would be to add a big red question mark. Is this actually a carbon neutral? We don't really know, and we don't know if it's going to be into the future. Okay, so that's kind of, I know this is a kind of a sad way to start the presentation, but I think it is also exciting because there are so many questions that we can ask. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the carbon cycle. Because countries and JetBlue are right, plants do have a lot of potential as natural climate change mitigators. What do I mean by that? So plants do this great thing called photosynthesis. You might have heard about this in high school, where they take light and carbon dioxide and water from the ground and the atmosphere, and they make carbohydrates, sugars from it, and they release oxygen. And this basic process has huge implications over the range of the world. So there's the carbon cycle, right? So we're emitting carbon into the atmosphere, and plants are taking it up through photosynthesis and storing it in their leaves and in their wood. And it's taking a lot of the carbon that we produce out of the atmosphere and is really important for limiting the amount of climate change that we are experiencing. Here's a really interesting figure, I think. On the bottom here, we have time from 1750 until the present day. And on the y-axis, this is showing the carbon going into the atmosphere in the positive area. These are carbon emissions, and carbon coming out of the atmosphere in the negative area, the sinks of carbon. And they break this up. So you can see that over time, humans emitting fossil fuels and carbon from cement production has increased dramatically. So has deforestation. This is this brown area. So this is carbon being emitted into the atmosphere. And then it's balanced by the ocean in this dark blue, which takes up a lot of carbon in the atmosphere every year. This is the atmosphere itself. So this is what is just staying in the air, this lighter blue. And then this is my research. This is the plants, and this is what plants are doing every year. As you can see, that it's also increased over time, and there's a lot of research going on as to why that might be. And also, it takes up about 1/3 every year of the carbon we emit. So plants are really important. But there are a lot of questions. One question is, we know that this sink has increased over time, but is it going to continue to increase in the future? Is it going to kind of level off because plants say, okay, we can't eat anymore, we can't grow so much every year? That's a big question. Another big question is, look at these really, really huge variations. So some years the plants are actually emitting carbon. They're releasing more than they're taking in, maybe when there's a big fire. And other years they're sinking a ton, a huge amount of carbon. So there's this really, really extreme variation. And there's a lot of questions about why we're seeing that, and how that might change going forward with continued climate change. So it's a lot of information. This is kind of the big questions that are in my field and what people are thinking about here. Another element of all of this is how the carbon cycle affects the water cycle. These things are really inherently connected because the more photosynthesis plants do, the more water they require. The more plants that we plant, the more water that requires. And actually, over the scale of landscapes, a huge forest can take a lot of water out of the ground to use for photosynthesis, and that might limit how much water people have access to. So my research is really focusing on the intersection of how water and carbon relate to one another. And I'm excited to talk to you more about that right now. So the way that I am studying some of these questions is by using satellite data. Satellites are really cool. There are a lot of them all around us, and they're observing the Earth from space using these really fancy cameras that they have pointed down at the surface. And they can see things that we couldn't see necessarily with the human eye. I work with data from a pair of satellites called GRACE, which is a long acronym, but basically it's just two satellites traveling in tandem. And this is a little movie of them. That white line in between them represents a laser. They're shooting a laser at one another. And they can see how far apart they are from each other. And as they orbit around the Earth, changes in gravity increase or decrease the distance between them, and they can tell over time how the surface is changing. And the biggest thing that's changing on the surface is water. So they can see from year to year how a glacier is melting or gaining in mass. They can see snowfall. They can see groundwater. This is a really, really cool satellite. It's been up there for about 20 years and has a lot of really interesting information. The movie on the right side is showing an image from GRACE from, I think, a month-long scale. And you can see that there's a lot of water in the Himalaya, in the Alps, in Greenland, in Alaska. And this is the satellites picking up on glaciers and in tropical forests and stuff like that. Here is another movie made from the same pair of satellites, but this time we have used an algorithm that can actually divide the water that it sees into different layers, from soil moisture to root zone soil moisture to groundwater. So different depths of water in the ground going down. And this is a map of the US, and the blue is showing wetter conditions and the red is showing drier conditions. And we can look at this throughout time and how it's changing, and start thinking about how this might also change in the future. So here is another great thing that satellites can see, which is plant growth. You can see the seasonal cycle here of trees gaining leaves in the summer and losing them in the winter. So another awesome thing that you can see from space. Moving on to some of my own research questions. My first project that I'm working on right now is pairing these two pairs of data that I just showed you. The different layers of groundwater and this map of tree cover and plant response. My idea is to look at when it's really dry, for example, which of these layers is affecting trees, looking at the correlations between these things over time and space, which I hope will give us a better sense of how, if we're expecting more drought in the future, how that might impact plants in the future, and vice versa. So I'm specifically looking at these different layers also to understand, say if it's really dry on the surface, but we see that trees are really green still and performing photosynthesis, they might be accessing that deeper, shallow groundwater through their root systems. I'm also hoping that this research can help explain some of this variation that we see in the carbon growth rate from year to year. So again, just these huge differences from year to year and how much carbon the plants can eat up on the Earth's surface. Here's some recent results from a paper I read from 2018. And you don't need to know these acronyms, but basically what this is showing is the anomaly of water. So globally, a wet year would be over here on the right and a dry year would be on the left. And from top to bottom here, it's showing how much carbon is being released into the atmosphere. So a positive number means carbon is going up into the atmosphere, and a negative number means it's being sunk by plants. And there's this really strong negative correlation where when it's a wet year globally, we're seeing a huge carbon sink. So plants are eating up a lot of carbon. But when it's dry, we're seeing a big release of carbon into the atmosphere. So this water storage term aligns really well with this variation. And I'm hoping to kind of pull out the complexities of this on a smaller spatial scale and see how this is varying, say, in America versus in Central America, or in Africa versus Australia, those types of questions, to see how it's happening locally too. And hopefully understand how it might change into the future. So we know that California is getting hotter and drier and experiencing more fires, for example. And I'm hoping that if we have a better sense of how water is affecting photosynthesis, we can also have a better sense of how much carbon plants might be able to store going forward, how much water they might require, and how much might be left over for people to use in agriculture. Yes, so those are some of my big questions that I'm thinking about and I'm hoping to explore throughout the course of my PhD. So just to recap, today I told you about climate change and this idea of net neutrality and how it is really uncertain. I talked to you about the carbon and water cycles and how they're interconnected and have huge implications for our policy and management of resources. I told you a bit about satellite data and how it's collected and how fun it is to work with. And then I finished up by telling you a bit about my research questions that I'm hoping to pursue throughout my PhD. And just to kind of conclude, climate change is scary, but science and activism can help. I am really excited to be working in this field, and I am so grateful to be an ARCS fellow. I think it's really helped me so much the past few months in getting set up here and focusing on my research questions, as well as helping me think about how I can do outreach and also engage as an activist and thinking about these types of policy decisions. So thank you so much, and thanks again for your ARC support. I think that's all I have, and I would love to hear any questions.
All right, Sophie, that was fabulous. I really, wow. I told you she was a rising star. Could we just do a round of muted applause for Sophie?
Thank you.
Okay.
Nice to see you.
It is really wonderful. And I know we have some questions. So if you have a question or two, please unmute yourself and go for it.
Questions.
Well, I'll ask you one to start with, Sophie. I understand that groundwater in California, like the Central Valley is sinking because they've sort of used up all of their groundwater. Is that true?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot that's happening around the world, actually. We're seeing land sinking because there's so much pumping going on. So that's a big issue for sure. And people are drilling deeper and deeper wells to get more and more water out. Yeah.
Right. India is having a huge issue with this, and I don't know if they'll solve it. Another question, please.
Have you read Bill Gates's new book on
Albert.
climate change?
I have not read Bill Gates's new book on climate change.
Yeah, I heard a very good, I've heard a very, very good interview with him on Amanpour and Company yesterday, and it's really interesting, and I think you would really enjoy it.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Okay, so Sophie, we promised to send you your gift for being our scholar speaker with a copy of Bill Gates's new book.
Okay, wonderful.
Another question? Peggy Newton.
I'm just curious to know who put those satellites, Grace, up?
That was NASA. That's a good question. Yeah, NASA puts up a ton of those satellites. Other space agencies too, but a lot of the data I work with is just from NASA.
So how do people have access to this? I mean, is it completely open source, or do you have to be associated with a university that plugs in with them, or?
Yeah, what's great about these data is that most of them are open source. You can just download them with a click. And that's been a really great thing for my research during the pandemic, especially because I don't have to do field work. I can just do it all on my computer. Yeah.
And you said that actually dry years, there was huge spikes in carbon emission, which is bad, like really bad,
Yes.
right? Okay,
Yeah.
wow.
Is,
But
I-
carbon isn't the only thing that's a problem, right? It's not just CO2, it's methane and polyfluorocarbons and refrigerators and food wastage puts a lot of CO2 in the air, right?
Oh, yeah. All of those things are big concerns. They all act in kind of different ways. I think there's a lot of focus on carbon because it is it stays in the atmosphere longest. So methane is a really powerful greenhouse gas, but it comes out of the atmosphere after about 9 years, whereas carbon will be up there for centuries.
I think Jerry has
One
a
more
question.
I have a question that has to do
Jerry.
with the water that's being taken from the deep pumping.
Mhm.
Is any thought, a lot of areas have no water and they do have desalination plants from the ocean. Is there any relationship to what's going on with converting ocean water to, usable water, impacting agriculture and our carbon base and all that sort of thing?
Huh, that's a good question. I don't know too much about desalination. I think since it's being drawn from the ocean, it probably wouldn't affect the land too much, but of course it takes energy to desalinate water, so it's emitting a lot of carbon to do that. Yeah.
Can't fill the holes up again, in other words. What they pumped out, they can't replenish.
Yeah,
Like-
it's tricky to do that. Yeah, that's a good question. I think a lot, at least in California, a lot of our water comes from the Sierras, so it would be a little bit tricky to do it in a natural way that would actually work. I don't know how how we could do it ourselves.
We have lots of water, it's just not the right place.
Hmm.
Sophie, we could go on the rest of the hour, and I just want to say thank you again on behalf of the chapter. We're so pleased that you're at UC Berkeley and ready to rock and roll, and I love your understanding that it's not just academic research, it's communication, education, activism, policy making. So we expect to see you again.
Wonderful. Yeah, it was so great to be
All
here.
right.
Thanks so much for inviting me.